All right, welcome back. Today we're going to cover a few different things. We're going to cover how to define functions, how to import functions into a different project, how to call functions, and also a little bit about variable scope, the difference between a global variable and a local variable. So let's get into it. First, I'm going to open up my previous projects I've been working in. If you recall, the last thing that we did was a two-player game where basically there's two different while loops that run inside of another while loop, and it allows you to have a player 1 turn and a player 2 turn. What we're going to do today is we're going to create a new project that project will take functions from. So right now we have this two-player turns Python file. As you can see, there's one while loop where there's a game running flag, and inside that there are two different turns which are while loops in themselves. We're going to return to this, but before we do, we're going to create a new project where we're going to import into this function or into this project. So let's go and create a new project by right-clicking on your solution file up here. Go to add, and we're going to add a new item. And this new item, I'm just going to call it battle functions. There you go. I'm going to click on add. Now we have a new project here. I'm going to put in my initials. I'm going to put in the date that I began it. And then I'm going to title it. All right. I'm also going to go over here on the side here and right click, and I'm going to set this as my startup file. All right, so first things first, let's talk about variable scope. We know what variables are. Very useful. Basically, they're buckets that hold information. But let's talk about the difference between global and local variable scope. What does that mean? Well, we already know how to make global variables. Global variables are typically variables that you just define inside the scope of a program. So right now I'm going to make a variable called var, and I'm going to set it equal to 34. It's an integer variable here. So I'm just going to create an initial variable, and this is actually a global variable because it can be run from anywhere inside here. And if I print var, when we run this program, you'll see that it will just show in the console whenever it decides to run. It's going to say what that variable's value is. There we go. It's an integer, but it's not being paired up with a string, so it's fine with printing. Excellent. Now I'm going to define a function. To define a function, you simply type def, and then you call the function whatever you want to call it. So in this case, I'm going to call it foo. You'll see this oftentimes in tutorials. You'll see people do this kind of stuff. And I'm going to create a function here. This is to illustrate to you I'm going to put var equals 24 inside this function. I'm going to print var. And then outside of this, I'm going to print var here. Okay, so what is happening? I'm actually going to run foo before I run that. So this is what's happening. We're creating a function right here called foo, and I'm setting this var value to 24. Then I'm going to print that var value. Let me change this 24 to 22 just to make it so where you can't confuse it. So there we go. Then what's happening is right down here, I'm calling the function. That's what's happening right here when I'm just writing foo and then the parentheses right there. That is me calling the function. And right here, I'm going to print the value of var. So the first thing is to a non-programmer, this might make sense as far as this is a way for us to change the value of var, but let's actually run this in our console and let's see what happens. And this is where the confusion usually sets in for programmers. What the heck is going on here? So let's look at how this code is printed out, and let's try to understand what is happening. So first, good morning. First, we have a variable that we're declaring, which is the value of 34 as an integer. After that, we're printing out that value. So if we look at our console, all seems to be right. We've got 34 right here. That's the first thing that happens in the console. It prints that out. Perfect. Then we're creating a function, and that function is called foo in this case. And what happens in this foo function is it's creating a variable called var, and it's setting its value equal to 22. Then it's printing out that variable. Now what you would think is, because this is called var and this is called var, that what is happening is foo should be changing the value of var to 22. You can see that it prints out var. When we call this function, it is doing this. It's making the value of var inside the function 22, and then it's printing it, which is what should happen when you call it. But then when I print out the value of var down here, you'll see that now it changed back to 34. What happened? I thought I changed var to 22 with this function. Well, the reason why is because of variable scope. Let's talk about what variable scope is. Variable scope is basically inside of a function like this. When I defined this foo function, this variable right here is only a local variable, which means it only works inside of this function. If you're trying to affect something outside of the function, you're going to have to pass this parameter through the function and then assign your global function to that value. So basically, if you do something inside of a function, do not expect it to actually affect the outside part of a variable, of a global variable. If you wanted to change that, there's two ways to do that. If I wanted to change the value of this global variable, what I can do two things. One is the method that is frowned upon by programmers because although it is simplistic and it makes sense, it can cause a lot of problems with larger things of code. And that is, you just say, I want, in this function, I want to affect the global variable called var. And if I do that, now whenever I mention var inside this function, it knows that it's actually talking about a global variable outside of the function. So that's one way that I could tell the function to affect something outside. But this is going to cause problems. I wouldn't recommend doing this, but let's just run it just so you can see what it does. I'm running this program now. At least I should be in a moment. Close this. So if I run this now, you'll see that the code has changed. Now it knows that inside this function, when I'm talking about the variable var, it's talking about the global variable, which is out here in this code out here. So it knows that when it changes var to 22 in this function, it's going to change it in the global sense. So that's why this last part right here, it is no longer 34. It actually did change it. In larger blocks of code, though, you don't want to use global variables like that. Instead, what you're going to do is you're going to use a parameter that you pass in to the function that changes that variable. So let's show you how to do that. So right now in this function right here, it has no parameters. It's just an empty parameter list. As you can see here, there's nothing in the parentheses. But what we can say is, I want to input into this this function right here. I want to make a possible parameter. So I'm just going to call it param. You could call it anything. You could call it x. You could call it y. You could call it whatever you want. I'm just going to call it parameter in this case. Now what that means is when you pass a number into these parentheses right here, it's going to treat that as a possible thing that can be changed. So right here where I have var equals 34, when I call the foo function, I could pass var in as my parameter like this. Instead of having it empty, when I'm calling it now, I'm going to use this var variable. And what that means is now when it comes into the actual function right here, it can use that parameter however we want. So let me say I want the param to add, let's just say I want to make it count up. So I'm going to make it go plus equals 1. That's an incrementation operator. We did this before. It basically will just add by however many steps you want here on the right side. So I'm going to put adding incrementation. All I want this to do is I want it to count up by 1. So it's taking whatever var is, or actually right now it's taking whatever the parameter is and it's going to add 1 to it. Then what I want it to do is I want it to return that number. So what that means is it's going to take whatever I run right here, it's going to pass the output as whatever happened above this. So right now I have parameter plus equals 1. Whatever I pass in as a parameter right here, it's going to add 1 to it, and it's going to return that number. So let's see what this looks like. Right now, I have, when I call the function, I could call it just with a number. I'm going to put just 1 in here to start. I'm going to comment this out just so you can see what this does. So right now I have the parameter foo 1, and then I want to, maybe I want to print what that is. So I could assign now var equals foo of 1. Let's see what that looks like. If I print var from here, what it's going to be doing is this. It's running the function of foo with 1 as its parameter. So it's going to add 1 to that and return it. And then it's going to assign that to the variable called var, and we'll print it out. Let's see what it looks like. It says, oh, it says none because we have to change what this param is right here. So return, we need to say return param. Sorry. There we go. So when we return it, we have to say what it's going to return. So right now it's taking this parameter, it's going to add 1 to it, and then we want it to return what that number was. So now let's try running it. And you'll see when we start, when we print var, it is this constant variable that we have here. But when we want to run this parameter right here, or when we want to run this function, it's using this parameter. In this case, we just put 1 in right here. It's going to add 1 to that parameter, and then it's going to return that parameter back to us. And in this case, it's assigned to now the variable or the var variable. Now what we could do is we could just put var in right here. Instead of the number 1, we could put a global variable in here. When it goes into the function, it becomes a local variable, but then we're reassigning it to a global variable here. So this should add 1 to our global variable now. Let's try running it by pressing F5. And there we go. It starts as 34 at the beginning of our code when we assigned it. It's printing it out, so that's what you see here. Then we created a function called foo, where we passed that variable called var into it. It takes that parameter, it adds 1 to it, then it returns that value. So now that value is basically right here, and we're assigning that to the value of the variable var, and then we're printing it out. So then you get to see that it is shown right here. And this is how we can change values. We can change global values with local variables, basically. This is the more accepted way to do things. If you keep on changing global variables, when you get into bigger code, it gets really messy and there's a lot of things that can go wrong. So a lot of times you want to use parameters that you pass into functions and then use the return command to assign something to a variable like this. So let's see how we can use this in action. This was just a kind of how it works, how global scope works. I'm going to comment this stuff out, and we're going to make something that we'll actually use in our two-player turn thing. So first thing that I want to do is I want to create a function. I'm going to create one that actually will help us. It's going to be roll die. We did this before. And we'll make a parameter called sides. And make sure you put a colon in there. We need to import our random functions. This is typically done as your library here. So just like before, we're going to create a roll die. In fact, we could go in and we could take it from another code if you want, but I'm just going to hard type it right now just so you can see how it's done one more time. So our current roll equals, actually it's going to be roll equals random.randint, and it's going to be from 1 to sides as its range. And we're going to print you rolled a, and then I'm going to use a comma and put in the roll integer. Keep in mind that this comes out as an integer, so if you don't separate it with a comma, if you use a concatenation operator, you would have to convert it into a string in order for it to work. But I'm just doing it this way. All right. And then I'm going to return roll. All right. So this is a function right here where it just rolls a die. It rolls it from 1 to sides. And in this case, when you call the function, you're going to say how many sides there are. So if I wanted to actually test this out just for right now, I could do it by typing in roll die. And in the parameter list, I have to make sure I put how many sides the die has. So I'm going to try running this. I rolled a 1. There we go. If I wanted to press F5 again, it should come up with something different. It's a pseudo random number, so you might get the same roll again. Who knows? But I rolled a 6. All right. Looks like I don't need that extra space right here. I'm going to take out this space. B206 is McDowell. Okay. There are, could you just do one at a time so they can still do their work on at least one machine at a time? 93, I think, is the one that they're working on at the moment. Yeah. Yes. Thank you. All right. All right. VR group, they're gonna boom into your machines and reinstall Visual Studio. Andre, they're gonna reinstall on these two machines right now. And then they're gonna swap it. So they're gonna remote it and install it. So this machine is good? No, this just the one that Scott is with. Okay. All right, my apologies there for those of you who are watching this stream. I had to take a phone call. All right, so right here I'm calling the function of roll die, and I'm using 6 as the number of sides, and that's how it returns it. So we can see that it works. Now I'm going to show you how you can import this battle function, or at least this single function, into our other two-player turn thing. So I'm going to save this. And I'm going to go back into my 2-player turns now, and I'm going to set this as my startup file. All right, so right now I have a 2-player turn-based game, and what we can do is at the beginning right here, we initialized our variables, our global variables. What I also want to do is I want to import what we just made. So I'm going to import battle functions. And what that means is any definitions, any of these things that we define, any functions that we define, are now imported into this code right here. So basically, what commonly a lot of programmers do is they create a project that has all their definitions, all their functions are written in a separate file, and you can import them into different other files. So right now I have all my battle functions definitions loaded up, which right now there's only one. It's this roll die right here. But now, if I want to try to make it to where when player 1 turn happens, right here I'm going to make it to where we roll a die. And to do that, we simply type in roll die. Because we have battle functions imported here, it will now search through battle functions. If we put battle functions dot roll die. So now we can, just like what we did before when we looked in here to battle functions, you see how we imported random, and then to make the random integer call, we had to put random dot and randint. Because inside the random library, there's a function called randint. In this case, we're using the battle functions library. So we want to say in battle functions, in the file called battle functions, hey Devin, we want to call the function called roll die. Now remember, you have to put some number in here that will be the number of sides. So I'm going to put 6 for now. And let's see how it works. If I press F5, it should say player 1 turn. When I press enter, it says I rolled a 6. All right. Player 2 turn, I press enter. I didn't put the battle function for roll die for player 2 yet, so it's just skipping them. But every time player 1 goes, it should roll that die. All right, let's make it to where they both roll a die now. So let's see. Let me go down here to where it's player 2 turn. I'm going to take, because I'm lazy efficient, I'm going to copy and paste this. There we go. Now I have battle functions.roll die. Let's say I don't want to pass this 6 in here. Let's say I want to make a global variable that I can pass into this function. So what I'm going to do is up here where I have my initial variables, I'm going to create a player 1 power or attack. Let's say that. Player 1 attack equals your power level is 10, let's say. And actually, let me put max attack so it makes sense. The maximum value that player 1 can attack is 10. All right, let's talk about player 2. Player 2's max attack will also be 10. Let's keep it fair for now. So now when I have a roll die right, I can make this player 1's max attack. That's going to be player 1's turn. You're going to roll a die. It's going to choose between the values of 1 and whatever that variable is, which right now is 10. And down here, I'm going to change this to be player 2's max attack. There we go. All right. So now when I run this, it's going to pass those in as the parameters, which in this case is the maximum value of the random range that we've created. So let me run this. Come on. There we go. So it says player 1 turn, you rolled a 5. Player 2 turn, you rolled a 4. And so on and so forth. I can keep on doing this. And just to test to make sure that you can see that there's different ranges, I'm going to make this grossly overpowered. I'm going to make player 1's max attack 1,000 and player 2's max attack is 10 and run this and let's see what happens. Player 1 turn, you rolled a 483. Player 2 turn, oh, a 9. All right. So this is what happens when you play, like MMOs and you go into the beginner noob region and they you fight a rabbit or something and you deal 9,999 damage. That's because of this. Because you can have different variables that are assigned to the combat value of different characters. So right here I have battle functions for player 1's max attack, and I have player 2's max attack. All right, so what have we covered today? We've covered how to define functions, variable scope, and global and local variables. We talked about importing functions. So what we did right here, where we imported our battle functions from our other .py file, that's us importing functions from another file. And lastly, we talked about calling functions, specifically using a different library, like right here, the battle functions dot, and then whatever the function is called. And we showed how to take an attack or take a variable, a global variable, and input it as a parameter into that function. These are all very useful. We can begin to start coding a little bit more interesting things, like if we wanted to have a hit points value, let's add that into our initial variables here. So let's have it to where there's player 1's hit points. I'll just put an underscore. So player 1's hit points, you start with 100 health. And player 2 will also start with 100 health. There we go. I'll make both of their attack values fair. I'll make it both 10. And now what I want to do is I want to make it to where this battle function right here is going to be the damage that is dealt. So right now it's rolling this. It's gonna make a number based off of a randomly rolled range right here, and I'm gonna save that as current damage. So I'm setting a variable that is going to be equal to this number right now, current damage. Now what I want to do is I want to make that current damage apply to the health of the opponent. So right here I'll make player 2 hit points equals, thank you, equals player 2's hit points minus that current damage. All right, so what's going to happen here? It's going to be player 1's turn. They're going to roll the die. Based off of their attack, it's going to make a number. That number is going to be saved as this current damage variable. Then the player 2's health is going to go down by what